Hello. We'll talk about basal ganglion today and some diseases related to basal ganglion like Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease. This is the drawing of my brain. And this is the longitudinal fissure, this is the lateral sulci, and this is the lateral ventricles and the third ventricle. So let's have a look at some structures of the basal ganglion. We have quite a few nuclei that makes up the basal ganglion. So first I'll talk about this these guys that make up the striatum. So this is our caudate nucleus, and together with the putamen, they're called the striatum. And we'll see why they're grouped together. So basically, the striatum is a functional group, and they are the ones that receive inputs into the basal ganglia. So the cortex will input into the striatum. And since we're onto the putamen, let's talk about other members of this triangle. So this triangle is called the lenticular nucleus because nucleus just means a group of gray matter. So on a histological slide, this whole thing will look gray. Yeah. And so they're just grouped together. This triangle sort of looks like lens, so it's called lenticular. So the other members are the globus pallidus internus, which is on the inside, so that's why it's called internus, and the globus pallidus externus. So these green guys, they're called globus pallidus. Next up is subthalamic nucleus. So subthalamic nucleus is called subthalamic because it's below the thalamus. So I'll tell you where the thalamus are. It's here. I think you might have guessed it. And the subthalamic nuclei are these. And further down in the midbrain, we have the substantia nigra, which I'll color black. So these are all the members. And let's briefly talk about how they're grouped functionally. So what basal ganglia does in the body is it helps our cortex, so like our prefrontal cortex, to really plan out the movement so that we get exactly the right amount of movement. Because if we don't have enough, we get stuff like Parkinson's, like we don't move enough, so we have shuffling gait, we sort of move really slowly, we can't turn very well. But then if you have too much movement, we get something like Huntington's chorea, and chorea means dance-like movement, so they can't control their limbs because they'll keep moving and moving a lot, like way over how much they should move. So the cortex will input into the basal ganglia, and then basal ganglia would then talk to the thalamus, and then the thalamus will feed back into the cortex. So where in basal ganglia does the cortex input into, the cortical fibers input into, is the striatum. And as we said, what consists of striatum is the caudate nucleus and putamen. So the cortical fibers have their input into the striatum. So what's the output? Because we know the basal ganglion sends fibers out to the thalamus. Our output is by the internal internal segment of globus pallidus. Or globus pallidus interna. So globus pallidus interna, and also the pars reticularis of substantia nigra. Because substantia nigra I forgot to tell you this. So substantia nigra, they actually have two parts, the pars reticularis and pars compacta. Pars reticularis is what sends the output fibers to the thalamus. So we can abbreviate this to pars reticularis of substantia nigra. So, and pars reticularis of substantia nigra. So these are the output, and they output into the thalamus. So cortex, basal ganglion, thalamus. A word on the pars compacta of substantia nigra is that they're involved in Parkinson's disease, so they're the ones that die off, and they have dopaminergic neurons. And we'll look at this more in detail later. There's two important pathways in the basal ganglia that ends up modulating movement. So the first is the direct pathway. And direct pathway is the direct one, so it's quite simple. It's like the pathway we just talked about. It's cortex to the striatum of basal ganglion, to the globus pallidus interna, and the pars reticularis of substantia nigra, and they just go straight out to thalamus. And what thalamus does is actually increase signals for movement. So you have more movement if you have more signals out from the thalamus. And this part is important because the output from the internal segment of globus pallidus and the pars reticularis of substantia nigra is that they send inhibitory signals to the thalamus. So they say move less. That's what they do. The striatum actually also sends inhibitory signals to the globus pallidus interna and pars reticularis of substantia nigra. So inhibition, so that they cancel, so it's actually activation. So direct pathway increases movement. Whereas the indirect pathway you have a bit more components. So we have the cortex going to the striatum. So as a revision, striatum consists of the caudate nucleus and putamen. That's the thing. It doesn't directly send signal to the output centers. So you have the output centers, globus pallidus interna, and pars reticularis of substantia nigra, sending signals to the thalamus. So here in between, we do a bit of a detour. So where do we go? Well, it's some of the members of basal ganglion that we didn't visit yet. Is the globus pallidus externa. And globus pallidus externa then talks to subthalamic nucleus. So subthalamic nucleus, which then talks to these guys. So we know from here to here already because they send inhibitory signals. So basal ganglion tells thalamus, no, less movement. What happens in between here then? Well, the striatum sends inhibitory signal to globus pallidus externa, which sends inhibitory signals to the subthalamic nucleus. But then the subthalamic nucleus sends excitatory signals to the to these output centers. So that means there's more inhibition to the thalamus. So indirect pathway ends up, when stimulated, ends up with less movement. There's actually one part that I left out, which is the pars compacta of substantia nigra, which is involved in the Parkinson's disease. So where does this come in? Well, it talks to the striatum. So the substantia nigra, pars compacta, will talk to the striatum by sending dopaminergic neurons. The interesting thing is, in the direct pathway, they bind to these specific receptors in the striatum to sort of increase the activity. So in the direct pathway, what the substantia nigra pars compacta does is it'll sort of enhance the direct pathway and increase the movement even more. And down here in the indirect pathway, what the dopaminergic neurons does is it also talks to the striatum. It's also dopaminergic, but they bind to different receptors so that they inhibit the striatum. So it sort of inhibits the indirect pathway. So when you think about it, when you stimulate indirect pathway, you decrease movement. So when you inhibit the indirect pathway, you sort of have less decrease in movement, so relatively a bit more movement. And we can kind of see this because in Parkinson's disease, the dopaminergic neurons in the substantia nigra pars compacta die. So this dies. So there is less inhibition on the indirect pathway, so more indirect pathway, so there's less movement. And also what happens is they die, so there's less activation of the direct pathway as well. So there's less of the increase in movement, so there's also decrease in movement. So all in all, Parkinson's disease, because of the death of pars compacta of substantia nigra, you have decreased direct pathway and decreased inhibition of indirect pathway. So you have decreased of the more movement and then less of the inhibition of less movement. So basically you have less movement. So less movement and then less movement. Okay, so that's for Parkinson's disease, because what happens in Parkinson's disease is the pars compacta of substantia nigra dies. Let's now talk about Huntington's disease. What happens in Huntington's disease is kind of simpler in a sense because it only affects the indirect pathway. So what happens is the neurons in the striatum, they die. So the neurons in caudate nucleus and the putamen. And this results in overall decrease in indirect pathway. So you have increased movement, so that's why you end up with chorea, because chorea is these dance-like movement that's so it's over movement. For hemiballismus is similar, because what happens is the neurons of the subthalamic nucleus die. Remember, in direct pathway, it doesn't involve the subthalamic nucleus. So hemiballismus is only about the indirect pathway. We have less of the subthalamic nucleus, so there's less activation of these inhibitors of movement. So it also results in increased movement. So what we see in patients with hemiballismus is they fling their arms and legs uncontrollably because the inhibition of movement is impaired. So this was our brief review of the basal ganglia and some diseases associated with it. I've always found the pathways hard, and that's why I made the video, and I hope it helps you guys as well. Thank you.